He was to be burned as a witch by dawn, until the lonely cowboy pulled out his pistol. That's what they were saying anyway. The whole town, what little there was of it, had turned out. A dry, dusty collection of wood and nails called redemption. But there wasn't a lick of it in the air that day. Just dust. Dust and the kind of heat that presses down on your shoulders, makes the sweat on your neck feel like a greasy film. The sun was a merciless thing in the sky, a white-hot coin that had been baking the cracked earth since morning and showed no sign of letting up. They had her tied to a post in the center of what they called a town square, which was really just a wider part of the dirt road between the saloon and the general store. The post was new wood, raw pine, smelling sharp and clean in a way that just felt wrong, set against the smell of unwashed bodies and fear. They'd piled kindling around her feet, dry brush and splintered bits of old crates. It was all so damn methodical, so calm. That was the part that got you. The quiet, neighborly way they were preparing to set a woman on fire. She wasn't screaming. That was the other thing. You'd expect screaming or begging or maybe praying loud enough for God himself to hear. But she was quiet. Her head was bowed, and a mess of dark hair, tangled with bits of straw and God knows what else, hid her face. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, a simple brown thing, and you could see where the rope had bit into the skin of her arms, raw and red. Every now and then her shoulders would shake, just a little, a tremor that ran through her whole body like a horse shivering off flies. But she made no sound. The silence was louder than any scream could ever be. It hung there in the heat, thick and heavy. The crowd wasn't a mob, not really. Not yet. They were just waiting. Men in worn-out dungarees, their faces grim and set. Women with their aprons still on, holding the hands of wide-eyed children, whispering to each other behind their hands. They looked like they were waiting for a preacher to start a sermon, or for the horse races to begin, a spectator sport. The town's blacksmith, a bull of a man named Jedediah, stood near the pyre with a torch in his hand, not lit yet, just waiting for the word. The word was supposed to come from a man named Preacher Elias, a thin, reedy man with eyes that burned with a fever that had nothing to do with the sun. He was the one who'd started it all. Whispers of a blight on the corn crop, of milk turning sour, of a fever that took 2 children in 1 week. And all of it, he said, all of it traced back to her, the outsider, the woman who lived in the shack at the edge of the woods and kept to herself. She didn't have a name, not one that anyone used. They just called her the woman. It was easier to burn something that didn't have a name. I heard someone say she'd cursed the Millers well. Someone else said they'd seen her dancing naked under a full moon, communing with devils. The stories grew, each one uglier than the last, until they weren't stories anymore. They were facts. Her silence was proof of her guilt. Her poverty, proof of her wickedness. Her being alone, the most damning evidence of all. The dust swirled around her bare feet. They'd taken her shoes. A small cruelty, but it felt significant. To stand on that hot, sharp ground, waiting for the fire. You could almost feel the splinters, the sharp little rocks. You could feel the silence pressing in. A bead of sweat traced a path through the grime on her cheek. It was the only thing that seemed to be moving. That single, slow tear of sweat. And the whole town watched, holding its breath, waiting for the sun to dip just a little lower, waiting for the signal to purify their town with fire. Now, before we go on with what happened next, I gotta ask you to do me a favor. It helps me know who's listening to these tales. Let me know down in the comments where you're watching this from. Just the city or the state, whatever you're comfortable with. If you're liking this story so far, if you're hooked and want to see where it goes, make sure you hit that subscribe button. It helps a whole lot. All right, let's get back to redemption. He wasn't part of the crowd. He stood back, in the sliver of shade offered by the general store's overhang, leaning against the rough wood of the wall. His name was Cain, and it suited him. He was a man who seemed to carry a brand of his own, one of solitude. He'd been in town for supplies, flour, salt, coffee, simple things. He hadn't planned on staying for the day's entertainment. Cain was a loner, not by accident but by design. His face was all harsh lines and sun-leathered skin, a map of hard miles and harder times. He wasn't old, but he wasn't young either. He was somewhere in that middle ground where a man's seen enough to know he doesn't want to see much more. He just watched. His eyes, the color of a washed-out sky, took in the scene without much expression. The preacher, the blacksmith, the silent woman. He saw the whole ugly picture. He'd seen it before in other towns, in other forms. People get scared, and when they get scared, they get stupid. They need something to blame, something to punish. It was the way of things. He had no stake in it. This wasn't his town, these weren't his people. And the woman was a stranger. He had his own ghosts to wrestle with. He didn't need to take on anyone else's. He shifted his weight, getting ready to just turn around, mount his horse, and ride out. Let them have their fire. Let them have their sin. It was none of his business. He took a step, the heel of his boot grinding into the dust. But then he stopped. He looked back at the woman. Her head had lifted just a fraction. She wasn't looking at the crowd or the preacher. She was looking at the sky, as if she was trying to memorize the color of it one last time. There was no defiance in it, no hope. Just a quiet, profound acceptance that was more heartbreaking than any plea. And something in Cain, a part of him he thought had died and been buried long ago, stirred. It wasn't a sense of justice. It wasn't heroism. It was more like a dull, familiar ache. The ache of seeing a trapped animal, knowing you should put it out of its misery but not having the heart to, and not having the guts to just walk away. The preacher, Elias, finally raised his arms. His voice, thin and sharp, cut through the heavy silence. "The hour of judgment is upon us. We will purge the wickedness from our midst. We will cleanse this land with righteous fire." The crowd murmured its approval, a low, ugly sound. The blacksmith, Jedediah, bent down and struck a match. The small flare of sulfur was unnaturally bright in the afternoon sun. He touched it to the torch. The oil-soaked rags caught with a whoosh, the flame orange and greedy. He started walking toward the pyre. Cain didn't think. Thinking was what got you into trouble. He just acted. He pushed himself off the wall, and his movements were slow, deliberate. He walked out of the shade and into the blinding sun. He didn't run. He just walked, straight toward the center of the square. People turned to look at him, their faces a mix of confusion and annoyance at the interruption. The preacher faltered mid-sentence. Cain didn't look at any of them. His eyes were fixed on the blacksmith. His hand didn't go to the Colt peacemaker on his hip. Not yet. He just kept walking, his boots making a soft, rhythmic thud in the dust. He stopped about 10 feet from the pyre, placing himself directly between the blacksmith and the woman. Jedediah paused, the torch held aloft, dripping fire onto the dirt. "Get out of the way, stranger," the blacksmith grunted, his face red from the heat and his own importance. Cain didn't answer. He just stood there, a bulwark of silent opposition. "This ain't your concern," the preacher screeched, pointing a bony finger. "This is the Lord's work." Cain's gaze flickered to the preacher for a second, flat and empty. Then it went back to Jedediah. He still hadn't said a word. The silence stretched. The only sound was the crackle of the torch. The crowd was getting restless now. This wasn't part of the show. "I said," Jedediah repeated, taking a step forward, "get out of the way." Cain's hand moved then. It wasn't fast. It wasn't a gunslinger's draw. It was a slow, deliberate motion. He pulled the heavy pistol from its holster. He didn't point it at anyone. He just held it, the dark metal looking cool and solid against the heat and the flickering light. The click as he cocked the hammer was deafening. It echoed in the square, a sound that meant business, a sound that everybody understood. "That's enough," Cain said. His voice was rough, like stones grinding together. It wasn't loud, but it carried. The blacksmith froze. The preacher's mouth hung open. The murmuring of the crowd died completely. There was a new silence now, one filled with tension instead of grim anticipation. Cain's eyes finally met the woman's. She had lowered her head again, but through the curtain of her hair, he could see she was watching him. A raw, unspoken thing passed between them in that moment. Not gratitude, not hope. Just a shared breath in a world that was trying to suffocate them both. He kept the gun level, not pointing at any one man, but at all of them. "Cut her down," he said, his voice just as flat as before. The blacksmith, Jedediah, looked over at the preacher, suddenly unsure of his righteous fury. The preacher sputtered, "You have no right. She's a witch, a servant of darkness." Cain didn't argue theology. He didn't debate the fine points of their fear. He just raised the barrel of the Colt a few inches, until it was aimed squarely at the preacher's narrow chest. I said, "Cut her down." The command was simple. It left no room for negotiation. The preacher paled, his fiery conviction evaporating in the face of such a cold, hard reality. He gave a jerky nod to the blacksmith. Jedediah, grumbling under his breath, threw the torch to the ground where it sputtered in the dust. He pulled a knife from his belt and lumbered over to the post, sawing at the thick ropes. The woman stumbled forward as they gave way, her legs weak. Cain didn't move until she was free. He gestured with the pistol. "Walk." She hesitated for only a second, then did as he said, moving toward him on unsteady feet. The crowd parted for her, a sea of hostile faces, their righteousness soured into sullen resentment. Cain kept the gun on them, his eyes scanning the crowd, watching for any sudden moves. He walked backward, pulling her along with him with a slight nod of his head, never taking his eyes off the townsfolk. He didn't holster his pistol until they reached his horse, which was tied to the rail in front of the general store. "Get on," he said, his voice still a low rasp. He gave her a rough hand up, and she settled behind the saddle, her hands grabbing onto the cantle for support. She was light, like a bundle of sticks. He swung himself up in front of her and didn't look back. He just kicked the horse into a trot, and then a canter, leaving the town of Redemption and its simmering hatred behind them. They rode in silence for hours. The sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in brutal shades of orange and red. The heat finally broke. The only sounds were the horse's hooves on the hard-packed earth and the creak of saddle leather. He took them into the low, rolling hills, following a path that was barely there, a trail he knew by heart. It led to his home. It wasn't much. A small, sturdy cabin made of rough-hewn logs tucked into a fold in the land, almost invisible until you were right upon it. A thin curl of smoke rose from the stone chimney, the last embers of his morning fire. He reined in the horse and slid from the saddle. He turned and offered a hand to her, but she was already sliding down on her own, her legs giving out a little as her feet hit the ground. He caught her by the arm, steadying her. Her skin was cold, despite the day's heat. He let go as soon as she was balanced. "Inside," he said, and it was an order, not an invitation. He went about his chores, unsaddling the horse, rubbing it down, giving it water from the trough. He moved with an economy of motion. A man used to the familiar rhythms of solitude. He was pretending she wasn't there. Maybe if he pretended hard enough it would be true. When he finally went inside, the cabin was dark, the last of the daylight failing. She was standing in the middle of the single room, a dark shape against the gloom. She hadn't moved. She looked like a ghost that had lost its haunting grounds. Cain grunted, striking a match and lighting the lantern on the table. The small flame pushed back the shadows, revealing the Spartan interior. A cot, a table with 2 chairs, a stone fireplace, and shelves holding a few tins and a handful of books. It was clean but stark, the home of a man who needed little and wanted less. He didn't look at her. He went to the fireplace, stirred the embers, and added a few pieces of wood. Then he filled a pot with water from a bucket and set it on the grate to heat. He opened a tin of beans and dumped them into another pan. All of it was done in silence. The actions were practical, necessary. They were a language he understood better than words. He took a clean rag from a hook, dipped it in the now warm water, and wrung it out. He walked over to her and held it out. She flinched, her eyes wide in the lantern light. For the first time, he got a good look at her face. It was smudged with dirt and streaked with dried sweat. But underneath it, she was younger than he'd thought. And her eyes. They were full of a deep, weary terror. "Your arms," he said, his voice softer than before, though still gruff. He gestured to the raw, red rope burns. She stared at the rag, then at him, then back at the rag. Slowly, cautiously, she took it from him. Her fingers brushed his, and it was like a spark of electricity. He pulled his hand back quickly. She sat down at the table and began to clean the wounds, her movements slow and pained. Cain went back to the fire, spooning beans onto 2 tin plates. He set one in front of her, along with a piece of hard bread. He sat opposite her and started to eat, not waiting for her to join him. It wasn't a meal to be shared. It was fuel. But she didn't eat. She just held the warm rag to her arm, her eyes fixed on the plate. The smell of the beans filled the small cabin. It was a simple, grounding smell. Food, warmth, safety. He finished his plate. the scraping of his fork the only sound. He watched her. She hadn't touched her food. He understood. It was hard to swallow when your throat was tight with fear. He got up, took a tin cup from the shelf, and poured some water into it. He set it down next to her plate. He didn't say, "Eat" or "drink." He just provided. He went and sat on the edge of his cot, his back to her, and began to clean his pistol, the familiar ritual of oil and steel a comfort. After a long while he heard it. A small sound. The clink of a fork against a tin plate. He didn't turn around. He just kept cleaning his gun, giving her the privacy of his back. But a small, tight knot in his own gut began to loosen. She was eating. It was a start. They existed like that for days. Two ghosts haunting the same small space, moving around each other in a careful, silent dance. He'd wake before dawn, light the fire, and go out to check his traps or tend to the horse. When he came back, she would be up, the cot she slept on made with a neatness that seemed out of place in the rough cabin. She never slept in his bed. She'd taken the spare cot without a word on that first night, and had claimed it as her own. She started to make herself useful. She'd sweep the floor with a makeshift broom she fashioned from twigs. She'd wash their plates in the basin. Small domestic acts that began to fill the silence. They were rituals of survival, not comfort. Each action was a question. Am I allowed to be here? And his lack of objection was the answer. He never told her what to do. She just seemed to see what needed doing and did it. One day he came back from a long ride to find she had mended a tear in his shirt, her stitches small and even. He looked at the shirt, then at her. She was watching him, her expression guarded, waiting for his reaction. He just grunted, folded the shirt, and put it away. But he'd seen the needle and thread she'd used, salvaged from a small kit he'd forgotten he even had. It was a tiny act of creation in a place that was built only for sustenance. The nights were the hardest. The darkness seemed to bring the memories with it. Sometimes he would wake to the sound of her crying in her sleep, small, muffled sobs that she would never allow herself in the light of day. He would lie on his own cot, staring at the log ceiling, and listen, his own ghost stirring in response. He never went to her. He never offered comfort. He didn't have any to give. All he could do was bear witness to her pain, just as she bore witness to his stoic silence. One afternoon, he was splitting wood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a steady beat against the quiet of the hills. She came and stood nearby, watching. After a while, she began to gather the split logs and stack them in a neat pile against the cabin wall. They worked like that for an hour, a team forged not of affection, but of shared necessity. He paused to wipe the sweat from his brow and saw her looking past the cabin up the rise. There were 2 graves there, marked with simple wooden crosses, weathered and gray. They were stark against the green of the hillside. He had never mentioned them. He had assumed she'd seen them, but they had never been acknowledged. "My wife," he said, his voice startlingly loud in the quiet air. "And my boy." He didn't look at her as he spoke. He just stared at the graves himself, as if seeing them for the first time. "Fever. Took 'em both in the same week last winter." He set the axe down and leaned against the handle. He wasn't telling her a story. He was just stating a fact, the way you'd state that the sky was blue or the ground was hard. The words were stones he was pulling out of his own chest. "This land. It gives, but it takes more. I built this place for them, for a life, but it just became a place to bury 'em." He fell silent, the confession hanging in the air between them. It was the most he had said at one time since she'd arrived. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't offer any empty platitudes. She just stood there, her hands full of wood, and listened. Then, in a voice so low he almost didn't hear it, she spoke. "They said my poultice soured the milk," she said, her eyes on the ground. "Mrs. Gable's baby got sick. I'd given her some herbs for the colic the week before, just chamomile and mint. But when the baby's fever got worse, her husband, he went to the preacher. It was easier to blame me." She spoke in a flat monotone, a direct recounting of events, just as he had. "My husband died on the trail coming out here. I had no one, no family. I was just the woman in the shack at the edge of the woods. An easy person to blame." She finally looked up and her eyes met his. There was no plea for pity in them. There was just a raw, shared understanding. 2 people who had been stripped bare by the world, left with nothing but their own wounds. He gave a slow nod. The ghosts were out in the open now. They stood there for a long moment. The man who had lost everything and the woman who had never had anything. And for the first time, the silence between them felt less like an absence and more like a space they could share. He picked up his axe. She went back to stacking the wood. The rhythm of their work resumed, but something had shifted. The cabin wasn't just his shelter anymore. It was theirs. The peace, if you could call it that, was a fragile thing. A bubble of quiet in a world that didn't like things to be quiet for long. The threat came on a Tuesday. Cain knew they were coming before he saw them. His horse, tethered outside, got restless, snorting and stamping its feet. He was sharpening a knife by the fire, the scrape of steel on stone a meditative sound. He stopped, his head cocked, listening. Then he heard it, the jingle of harnesses, the low murmur of voices, more than one man. He stood up, grabbing his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. The woman was by the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. 3 of them, she whispered, her voice tight. The preacher, the blacksmith, and the miller. Cain moved to stand beside her, looking out. The 3 men from Redemption were riding up the trail, moving with a grim purpose. They weren't carrying torches this time. They were carrying rifles. "Get away from the window," he said, his voice low and calm. He pulled a heavy crate in front of the door, barricading it. He checked the load in his rifle. His movements were efficient, no panic, just preparation. This was a language he knew, a problem he could solve. He saw her grab the cast-iron skillet from the hearth, her knuckles white as she gripped the handle. She stood near the fireplace, out of the line of sight from the door or window, her body tense as a coiled spring. A raw, survivalist unity. They hadn't discussed it. They didn't need to. He was the gun. She was the desperate, cornered thing with the only weapon she could find. The riders stopped 100 yards from the cabin. The preacher, Elias, cupped his hands around his mouth. "Cain, we know you're in there, and we know you have the witch with you." Cain didn't answer. Silence was a weapon too. Let them sweat. Let them wonder. "You're harboring a fugitive from God's own justice," Elias shrieked, his voice cracking with piety. "Send her out, and we'll let you be. This is your only warning." Cain raised his rifle and fired. He didn't aim at them. He aimed at a rock a few feet to their left. The shot was a deafening crack that echoed through the hills. The bullet ricocheted with a high-pitched whine. The riders' horses shied, and the miller almost fell from his saddle. It was an answer, clear and direct. The blacksmith, Jedediah, recovered first. He swore, raising his own rifle. A shot rang out, thudding into the log wall of the cabin, right next to the window. Splinters flew. The woman flinched but didn't make a sound. She just gripped the skillet tighter. Another shot. This one shattered the single pane of glass in the small window. The sound was sharp, violent. Cain was already moving, hunkered down below the window line. He edged toward the other side of the cabin, where a small, shuttered opening looked out on the flank of the hill. He motioned for her to stay put. He eased the shutter open a crack. The 3 men had spread out, taking cover behind a cluster of rocks. They were planning a siege. They thought he was trapped. But Cain knew this land. He knew every rock, every dip, every shadow. This wasn't a trap for him. It was his home ground. "They mean to wait us out," he muttered, more to himself than to her. "Or set the cabin on fire." Her eyes widened at the word fire. The old terror was back, stark and raw. He saw it. "They won't," he said, and there was a certainty in his voice that was absolute. He wasn't just reassuring her. He was making a promise. The sun crawled across the sky. Another shot would ring out periodically, a reminder that they were still out there, waiting. The tension in the small cabin was thick enough to choke on. They didn't speak. They just waited, listening to the sounds from outside, listening to the sound of each other's breathing. They were a single unit of defiance bound by a shared threat. The standoff dragged on, the silence outside punctuated by the occasional taunt from the preacher or a pot shot from the blacksmith that would thud harmlessly into the thick log walls. Cain knew they couldn't stay in the cabin forever. Their water would run out. The men outside would get bolder as night approached. He had to break the stalemate. He looked over at the woman. Her face was pale in the dim light of the cabin, but her eyes were steady. The skillet was still in her hand. She was ready. He pointed to the back of the cabin, where a loose floorboard hid a small crawl space leading out under the rear wall. It was a bolt hole he'd dug for emergencies. "When I go," he said, his voice a low command, "you wait for 3 shots. Then you go out the back. Head for the creek. Follow it north. Don't stop." She stared at him, understanding dawning in her eyes. He was planning to draw their fire, to be the diversion. "No," she whispered, the first word of defiance she'd ever aimed at him. "Yes," he countered, his tone leaving no room for argument. "They want me, or you. They can't have both." He didn't wait for her to agree. He moved to the front door, his rifle ready. He took a deep breath. "Stay down," he ordered. Then, with a sudden, explosive movement, he kicked the crate away from the door and threw it open, firing 2 quick shots into the rocks where the miller was hiding. The men outside, startled by the sudden aggression, returned fire immediately. Bullets splintered the door frame. Kane was already gone, diving out the side window he'd shattered earlier, rolling into the cover of a thicket of brush he knew was there. He was a shadow moving through the landscape, using the terrain he knew so well. He circled around, silent as a wolf coming up on their flank. He could hear them shouting, distracted by the frontal assault on the cabin. Jedediah was yelling, "He's still in there, pinned down." Kane smiled, a grim, tight-lipped thing. He raised his rifle. He wasn't aiming to kill, not yet. He fired. The shot kicked up dirt right by the blacksmith's feet. Jedediah yelped and jumped back. Kane fired again, this time splintering the stock of the miller's rifle as it rested on a rock. The third shot whistled right past the preacher's ear. 3 shots. The signal. He saw a flicker of movement at the back of the cabin. She was out. She was running, low to the ground, disappearing into the thick woods that bordered the creek. Good. Now he just had to keep these fools busy. The 3 men were in disarray, firing wildly into the trees, unsure where he was. He was a ghost in the hills, his shots coming from one direction, then another. He was hurting them, pushing them away from the cabin, away from the creek, away from her. The fight, if you could call it that, lasted another hour. It was a battle of nerves, and theirs broke first. As dusk settled, casting long, spooky shadows, the miller had had enough. He scrambled for his horse, shouting that he wasn't going to get killed in the dark by some crazy mountain man. The preacher, seeing his small army deserting him, hurled a few last curses into the woods before scrambling after him. Only Jedediah the blacksmith remained, his pride stung. He stood alone, rifle in hand, peering into the growing darkness. "Coward!" he yelled. "Show yourself!" Kane did. He stepped out from behind a large oak tree, not 30 yards away. He wasn't holding his rifle. He was just standing there, his arms crossed over his chest. Jedediah, startled, raised his rifle. Kane didn't flinch. "Go home, Jedediah," Kane said, his voice calm and weary. "It's over." The blacksmith hesitated, the rifle wavering in his hands. He looked at Kane's empty hands, at the dark woods, at the silent cabin. The fight had gone out of him. He was a blacksmith, not a killer. With a final, frustrated curse, he lowered the rifle, turned, and stomped over to his horse, hauling himself into the saddle and riding off without a backward glance. Kane stood there until the sound of the horse's hooves faded completely. He was alone again. He walked back to the cabin. It was empty and silent, the front door hanging open, the interior dark. A profound sense of loss hit him, sharp and unexpected. He had sent her away. He had saved her, but he had sent her away. He stepped inside, the broken glass crunching under his boots. Then he saw her. She was sitting at the table, the skillet on her lap. She hadn't gone. She had hidden in the woods as he'd told her to, but she had come back. She had waited for him. He stopped in the middle of the room, his rifle hanging limply in his hand. He looked at her, and she looked at him. No words were needed. She had chosen to stay. He had fought for her. The bond between them, forged in silence and survival, was now sealed in shared struggle. He slowly leaned his rifle against the wall and sank into the chair opposite her, the exhaustion of the day settling over him like a heavy blanket. She reached out, her hand hesitating for a moment before she laid it on his arm. It was the first time she had touched him willingly. A simple, grounding gesture, a silent acknowledgement. We are still here. Their life fell into a new rhythm after that. The shared danger had burned away the last of their caution with each other. The silence between them was different now. It was comfortable, a shared space rather than a void. They still didn't talk much, but their actions spoke for them. He'd be out mending a fence, and she would bring him a cup of water without him having to ask. She'd be tending to the small garden she'd started, and he would quietly leave a new shovel he'd fashioned by the gate. They were two parts of a whole, moving in tandem, but their isolation couldn't last forever. They were low on flour and salt, and the horse needed a new shoe. A trip to town was unavoidable. They both knew it. Cain didn't want to take her. He wanted to keep her safe in their small pocket of the world. But as he prepared to leave, she stood by the door, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her expression determined. She wasn't asking for permission. She was coming with him. He argued for a moment. "It's not safe. Neither is being alone," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. He couldn't argue with that. So they rode into redemption together, this time side by side on two horses, him having acquired a second one from a traveling tinker. The town went silent as they rode down the main street. It was the same kind of silence as before, but now it was laced with something else. Not just fear, but a grudging, resentful respect. Windows were peeked through. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. They were a sight, no doubt. The stoic, quiet man who had faced down three of their own, and the woman they had tried to burn, now riding beside him, her head held high. He ignored the stares. He went about his business, tying the horses in front of the general store. He told her to wait outside. As he went in, the store owner, a man named Peters, gave him a nervous look but served him without a word. The air was thick with unspoken judgment. While Cain was inside, a group of women came out of the dressmaker's shop across the street. They stopped and stared at the woman, whispering behind their hands, their faces pinched with disapproval. One of them, the preacher's wife, a woman with a face like a sour apple, detached herself from the group and walked over. "You have some nerve," Mrs. Elias said, her voice loud enough for half the street to hear. "Showing your face here, after what you did." The woman didn't answer. She just stood by the horses, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "Harlot," another woman hissed from the safety of the group. "Witch, living in sin with that man out in the hills. You're an abomination." The words were like stones, meant to bruise and batter. The woman flinched, a slight tightening of her shoulders, but she didn't break her gaze. Cain came out of the store then, his arms full of supplies. He saw the scene immediately. Mrs. Elias with her righteous fury, the other women like a flock of vultures, and the woman he'd rescued standing alone against their tide of hate. He didn't shout. He didn't make a scene. He walked calmly over to his horse and began packing the supplies into his saddlebags. Mrs. Elias, emboldened by his lack of reaction, took a step closer to the woman. "The devil will claim his own," she sneered, her face inches from the woman's. Cain finished tying the last bag. He turned, and his eyes, cold and hard as river stones, landed on Mrs. Elias. He didn't say a word. He just looked at her. He looked at her with such a profound and complete dismissal that she physically recoiled, her mouth snapping shut. His silence was a judgment far more damning than her shrill accusations. It said, "You are nothing. Your words are nothing. You don't exist." He then turned to the woman he was protecting. He offered her a hand up onto her horse, a simple public gesture of alliance. He mounted his own horse, and without a backward glance at the gawking, silent town, they rode away. His powerful, quiet action had been a louder shutdown than any angry retort could ever be. They had faced the community together, and they had won not by fighting, but by refusing to be broken. The town, however, wasn't done with them. Cain's quiet dismissal of the preacher's wife had been an insult they couldn't stomach. It wasn't about the woman anymore, not really. It was about him, the outsider who had defied their laws, their preacher, their way of life. He had held a mirror up to their ugliness, and they hated him for it. A few nights later, they came back. But this time, it wasn't just the preacher and his two cronies. It was a group of a half-dozen men, their courage bolstered by whiskey from the saloon, and their own self-righteous anger. They weren't trying to be quiet this time. They rode up to the cabin with torches held high, their shouts echoing in the night. "Cain, come out and face your judgment." It was Jedediah's voice, thick with drink. "You and your witch." Cain and the woman were inside. They'd been sitting by the fire, a rare moment of peace. The sound of the riders shattered it instantly. Cain grabbed his rifle. He knew this was different. This wasn't a siege, this was a lynching. "Barricade the door," he said to her, his voice grim. "Stay back. They'll burn us," she whispered, the old terror back in her eyes, raw and real. "Not tonight," he said, his jaw tight. He looked around the small cabin. It was a tinderbox. They couldn't stay here. The men outside were growing bolder, throwing rocks at the walls, their shouts getting uglier. One of them threw a torch, landed on the roof, and the dry shingles caught almost immediately. Smoke began to snake down through the ceiling. This was the line, the one he had sworn to himself he would never cross again. After his wife and son had died, he had made a vow. No more fighting for people, no more attachments, just survival, just him and his grief. But looking at the woman's terrified face, illuminated by the flickering light of their burning home, he knew that vow was already broken. He had let her in. He had defended her. She was his now, his responsibility, his to protect. "We're going out," he said. "Stay behind me." He kicked the back door open, not the main one, but a smaller one he'd built for firewood. The night air was cool, but it was thick with smoke. The men, distracted by the fire on the roof, were all at the front of the cabin. Cain and the woman slipped out into the darkness, moving toward the cover of the woods. But one of the men saw them. "There they are," he yelled. The group turned, their faces demonic in the light of the fire and their torches. They started toward them, a clumsy, drunken mob. Cain pushed her behind him. "Run," he said. But she didn't. She stood her ground, her hand gripping the back of his shirt. They were cornered with the woods at their back and the mob in front. Jedediah was in the lead, his face flushed. He lunged forward and grabbed for the woman's arm. That was the moment the line was crossed. Cain moved. It wasn't the slow, deliberate action of the man in the town square. This was something else. It was fast and brutal. He didn't reach for his gun. His fist shot out and connected with Jedediah's jaw with a sickening crunch. The big blacksmith went down like a sack of grain. Another man came at him with a club. Cain sidestepped, grabbed the man's arm, and used his momentum to throw him into another one of his friends. They collapsed in a heap. The violence was sudden, decisive, and utterly without glory. It was the desperate, ugly work of a man protecting his own. He stood over the groaning men, his chest heaving. The fire from the cabin roof cast a hellish glow on the scene. The rest of the mob had stopped, their drunken courage failing them in the face of such efficient brutality. Cain's eyes were blazing. He was no longer the quiet, solitary man. He was something older, something more primal. "Get," he said, the word a low, dangerous growl. "Get off my land, and if any of you ever come back, I will bury you on it." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. The men stared at him, then at their friends on the ground. They began to back away, stumbling over each other in their haste to get to their horses. They fled into the night, leaving behind the smell of smoke and fear. Cain stood there, breathing heavily, until they were gone. The fire on the roof was spreading. The cabin that had been his refuge, their sanctuary, now being consumed by flames. He turned to the woman. She was staring at him, her eyes wide, not with fear of him, but with something else. Awe, understanding. He had crossed a line for her. He had shed his solitude and his vow and had chosen her. He had become a man of violence again, all for her. They watched the cabin burn. The home he had built with his own hands, the place where he had mourned his family and found a new, fragile kind of life, was turning to ash. The fire ate the logs, the roof, the memories. It licked at the night sky, a funeral pyre for the life they had known. When it was just a glowing, collapsing skeleton of what it had been, they turned away. There was nothing left for them there. He still had the horses, and they had the few supplies he'd bought in town. It was enough. They walked in silence to the small grove where he had buried his wife and son. He stood before the two simple crosses, his face illuminated by the dying glow of the fire. The heat of the flames had been a cleansing in a way. It had burned away the past. He was no longer just the man who had lost his family. He was now the man who had saved another. It was a heavy burden, but it was a living one. The woman came and stood beside him. The air was cool now, and smelled of pine and smoke. The tension of the fight had drained away, leaving a profound quiet in its place. All the big, loud events were over. The accusation, the rescue, the siege, the fight. All that was left was the two of them, standing in the wreckage. He had never asked her for her story, not the whole thing. He knew the shape of it, the ugly facts, but not the details. He had never asked her name. It felt too intimate, too permanent. She had been the woman, a temporary problem to be solved. But she wasn't temporary anymore. She was standing right here, having refused to leave him, having stood with him against fire and men. She looked at him, her face soft in the dim light. "They called me a witch," she began, her voice a low murmur, "because my mother was a healer. She taught me the herbs, how to find them, how to use them, not for curses, for comfort, for fevers, for pain." She spoke simply, without adornment, her words falling into the quiet space between them. "When she died, people in our old village started to look at me sideways. They were afraid of what they didn't understand. That's why I left. I came west, looking for a place where I could just be. I thought redemption was that place. I was wrong." She paused, her gaze distant for a moment, lost in the memory. "The man who died, my husband. He was a good man, kind. He believed in me. He used to say my hands were made for gentle things." A tear traced a path down her dusty cheek, but her voice didn't break. "When he died, I think the best part of me died with him. I forgot how to be anything but afraid. When they tied me to that post, I was ready to die. I didn't think there was anything left to live for." She turned her head and looked directly at Cain, her eyes clear and steady. "You showed me I was wrong." The silence that followed was full of unspoken emotion. He had done more than save her life. He had given her a reason to want it back. "My name," she said, and the words were a gift, a final piece of trust she was placing in his hands. "It's Alara." He didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at her. This woman named Alara. The name had a strength to it, a beauty. It was real, solid. It replaced the ghost he had rescued with a person. He let the name settle in his mind. Then he spoke it aloud, his rough voice softening around the edges. "Ilara," he said. It felt right. It felt like a foundation stone for whatever came next. He had lost his home, but in the ashes, he had found her name. And somehow, that felt like a fair trade. They couldn't stay. The land was tainted by the fire and the fight. The graves of his family would remain, but he could no longer live in their shadow. The morning after the fire, as the sun rose over the smoking ruins of the cabin, they packed what little they had onto the horses. There was no discussion about where they were going. The only direction was away. They rode for days, heading north, into wilder, emptier country. They spoke little, but they moved as one, a quiet, determined pair against the vast, indifferent landscape. They were searching not for a town or a community, but for a piece of ground that felt clean. A place that didn't have any ghosts yet. They found it in a high mountain valley, a place of tall pines and a clear, fast-running river. The air was sharp and clean, and the silence was deep and peaceful. It was a place where you could hear yourself think, a place to start over. They made a rough camp by the river. The first few weeks were hard. They lived off the land, Cain hunting and fishing, Alara gathering edible roots and berries she recognized from her mother's teachings. They worked from sunup to sundown, their days filled with the simple, back-breaking tasks of survival. They were building a life from scratch, with nothing but their own two hands and a shared will to endure. One day, Cain was clearing a small patch of land near their camp. The soil was dark and rich. He was turning it over with a makeshift spade, preparing it for something. He wasn't sure what. It was just an act of faith, of imposing order on the wilderness. Ilara came over watching him work. Her hands were no longer soft, but they were capable, stained with dirt and berry juice. She had a small leather pouch in her hand, one she had salvaged from her old life, one he had never seen her open. She knelt beside him in the freshly turned earth. She opened the pouch, and inside were a handful of seeds. They were small and dark and unassuming. "What are they?" he asked. "From my husband," she said, her voice soft. "He bought them for me, for the garden we were going to have. I've carried them all this way. They were seeds of a life that had never been given a chance to grow. She held them out to him on the palm of her hand. He looked from the seeds to her face. Her eyes were full of a quiet hope that he was just beginning to recognize. He took a few of the seeds from her palm. His rough, calloused fingers brushed against hers. He took a pointed stick and made a small hole in the dark earth. He dropped a single seed into the hole and covered it over. Then he made another hole, and she dropped a seed in. They worked together in silence, planting the seeds one by one in the rich soil of their new valley. It wasn't a promise of a grand future or a declaration of love. It was something much simpler and much more real. It was a seed of belonging, an act of putting down roots in a world that had tried to tear them up. They were planting a garden in the wilderness, two broken people choosing to grow something new, together. If you enjoyed this story, please give it a like and subscribe for more just like it. It really helps the channel out.